And so I just want to give you that so that it wasn't a stopping point. Oklahoma City, 1964. On that December morning, Jim had worked for exactly 4 years as a bank examiner for the FDIC. He and his wife Martha had created routine, ritual that made light of the Monday morning departure to another small town in Oklahoma, a town whose only bank had a scheduled audit. The examining team guarded their schedule, though. Surprise was essential. That Wednesday night phone call home was part of the ritual. After a day at the bank of the week and a quick dinner out with the other two guys on the team, Jim went back to his hotel room, put his finger in the zero hole designated O for operator. The operator would then place that expensive long distance call, and Martha would answer with a giggle. The celebration, also part of the routine, began the following Friday evening when his car pulled into the driveway. Good to be home, he would whisper to himself every time when he saw the faces of his three children peering out through the window, waiting for him like he was their hero. Martha always had a meatloaf waiting in the oven, her special recipe, wrapped in bacon. How he longed for his days on the road to end, and how marvelous it was this week to have on his calendar an Oklahoma City bank. I don't have to be on the road, he crowed and hugged Martha and the kids. While driving to the May Avenue Bank that Wednesday morning, he thought about how uneventful the first 2 days of the audit had been. The rest would be a breeze. Then a passing thought flitted through his head. He was thinking about a different chapter of his life, the 1940s, when he was a liaison pilot just out of his teens, flying over German artillery and radioing back the location of the enemy. It had been nearly 20 years since his last flight, and he wasn't sorry. Shortly after the bank opened, Jim stood in a teller's window. He was just about to ask the teller where the key was so that he could count the money in the register. Then he heard it. A man's voice, probably a baritone if he sang, but not a deep one. As a trombonist, Jim always noticed the range of people's voices. Ladies and gentlemen, the slightly melodic voice called out, could I have your attention? This bank is being robbed. The man held a gun in his right hand. The handles of the grocery sack were draped over his wrist. As he walked from one teller window to another, he used his left forearm to sweep each register's cash into the sack, while his right one kept the gun pointed at the teller. If it wasn't so frightening, it would look like quite the juggling act. Then the robber strode up to the window where Jim was standing. Jim stared at the gun barrel and then at the man. The gunman's eyes stared back, wild eyes of fear, with wide rings of white showing around the pale blue irises, barely visible around the oversized pupils. Sweat dripped down in beads from under the guy's baseball cap and hung on the wisps of hair peeking out. Jim stood with his hands raised, shoulder level. He gave the man a completely opaque face, as if he were bluffing at cards. This window is a loan window, Jim said, careful to have no emotion in his voice. There's no money at this register. The round, dilated eyes took Jim in. Then the man nodded and continued on to the remaining windows. In a front page report later that afternoon, the Oklahoma City Times stated that children played undisturbed in the lobby while the robbery continued. Once the robber had been to all the windows, he turned around and faced the bank lobby. Thank you, he said clearly. Then he left. In the few minutes between the robber's departure and the arrival of the FBI, Jim asked the teller to open the register. Oh my, he whistled. Wall-to-wall money. Hundreds, fifties, twenties, well over $20,000. For days afterward, Martha and the kids bugged Jim about what he had said to the robber. Why did you say that? Martha was totally baffled. It makes no sense. After all, isn't robbery one of the incidents the FDIC insures against? Jim just couldn't put it into words. He knew he wasn't being altruistic, but what, indeed, was he thinking? The next weekend at the family Christmas party, the robbery was all the talk, especially since it hit so close to home. After Jim had regaled his brothers and sisters-in-law with the story, he saw that his 13-year-old niece Vicky was listening. She had fixed her light green eyes on him. She was about to burst with a question. Uncle Jim, why did you say that? She said quietly. Jim knew Vicky well. She was 6 months older than his own daughter, Paula. Vicky's face was a familiar one at the dinner table. The girls were like sisters. Now he took her words in, the same words his wife and kids had asked him, but with Vicky, the spirit under the question was different. He saw that her eyes were patient and yet hungry for the truth. Then it all came together. He was able to put words to the thing that guided his actions. Vicky, this is how it was, Jim began in his storytelling voice. He scratched his head, a full head of black hair, and traced his thinking. This was the first time I'd been in the teller windows at that bank. I didn't know where the key was to unlock the drawer. What difference would that make? The girl pressed on. I couldn't afford to try to open it and fail. Jim's reasoning became clear as he continued. If I fumbled, he might think I was triggering an alarm. At that point, my main goal was just to keep him from shooting me. As he told Vicky the story, Jim now understood his reasoning, the strategy that seemed to unfold under his awareness. The question then was not just why, but how. How indeed had he come up with all of that in a matter of seconds? How did he notice the gunman's fear, keep his own hidden, and put together a believable lie so quickly? Even though he had put the words together that formed an explanation, it was hard to comprehend, even to himself. It was as incomprehensible as the way, years before, his guts had rumbled when he was in his two-seater in the air. The rumbling told him, even before he looked down, that the enemy was nearby. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.